Call this special Board of Education workshop meeting to order, please. Suzette, could we do the roll? Suzette, you're muted.
Still muted.
There we go. There we go. Okay. Ms. Klug.
Here.
Mr. Schultz.
Here.
Mrs. Kaiser.
Here.
Mr. Lee.
Here.
Mr. Ustruck.
Here.
Mrs. Justum.
Here.
Mr. Sikich.
Present.
Mr. Keller.
Here.
And President Emmons.
Here. All right. So we've got 2 items on our agenda for this evening for our workshops. And 3.1 is our equity plan. Dr. Lexman.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for folks that are joining us that have been part of the equity team and the effort to implement this part of our strategic plan. And what I wanted to do is just frame this up within that context, right? So our equity work is something that we've been committed to for years, but that more so now than ever, given the refresh of the strategic plan, the equity work, and we really talk about it as equity through deeper learning, is really front and center for us. And even though right now it feels like COVID and everything COVID related to schools is front and center, the real work, the larger work, is really this commitment within our strategic plan of equity through deeper learning. And as I think about it and as I work on it, and 2 big ideas that I try to really kind of not rationalize, but that really try to be mindful of all the time, is that part of this work is really the effort to not continue to replicate or to disrupt the replication of the experience of historically marginalized kids in schools, right? So that big idea is that we've got to be committed to not replicating that. And because we are part of that as a system, we have to be committed to disrupting it. And so that's a big piece of this. But the other part of it that I try to really think about and discuss, and Deidre kind of helps me with this as well, is that as we look at our equity non-negotiables, but even more importantly, the social justice standards. And when you think about the social justice standards for kids, and you start reading them and talking about them, it's pretty hard to say we don't want that for a kid, that we don't want those things for every kid, right? When you start to really think about them, talk about them, yeah, we want those things for all of our kids. Those are good ideas. And so it becomes both of those for me, about this idea of disrupting the past that marginalized kids, but also committing to things that are bigger for every single kid. And so that kind of puts kind of a real high level kind of context on it. And so what I'd like to do is turn this over to Deidre, who's then really going to turn it over to the folks that, think about it, talk about it, and do it more so than I do every single day, because it really is at the level of schools and classrooms that the opportunity exists for us to truly make a difference. So with that, Deidre, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And good evening, everyone. We are really excited to be here tonight to talk about the work we've been doing around our plan to embed the deeper learning competencies across all classrooms as our pathway to equity. And as you know, as a board, we adopted our equity non-negotiables actually in June of 2019. And reflectively, we were having some conversations about how much did we do to actually mobilize those so that they really do live and breathe as belief statements, because our belief statements should drive action for us. And we really kind of started to say, well, time out. By about December, January of last year, I don't know that we were doing as much as we could have been to really mobilize those and push into that space. And we had started to have a lot of conversation with the committee, my board committee, our board committee, and our principals and things like that in that late January, early February time. And then the world happened and COVID hit. And then there were some incidents around our nation that really brought to light some of the inequities in our world. So For us, it was that window to say the work we are doing is super, super important, but more than ever, important to keep at the forefront so that our kids are prepared to go out and handle some of these situations in a way that's about citizenship and bringing together our community. And while much of this work is perceived as being very political and it's become very politicized in the world, the intention of the work around our pathway to equity being through deeper learning is about humans. And it is about making our classrooms places that are communities where everyone has a voice. And regardless of what your political beliefs are, regardless of what your opinion on something is, as long as it's not harmful to another human being, that our classrooms should be places where that can have a voice and where children understand and students understand how to disagree about something without quite the level of conflict or disagreement that we see across our world today when it comes to some of those high level topics. And as we spent a lot of time in early June trying to say, what would our summer look like as we really pushed into this space? What would our summer look like if we really dove deep into what we were trying to do? And how do we get it to be framed around what is good for human beings and what's good for communities and for that sense of belonging in every classroom, where I feel like I am seen as a person and my identity is important, and I understand other people's identity and that those are important, and that I can understand justice and the historical marginalization that's led us to the point in time that we are today. And then I can take action as a citizen and as a responsible person in our world in a way that creates change without necessarily inciting conflict in the way that we are currently approaching that work a lot of times across our nation. And so that is where Marty, as Marty said, we landed on the social justice standards, and it really seemed to frame what we were doing. And then it aligned a ton the standards to the work that's outlined in our equity non-negotiables. I have a link to the equity non-negotiables here, and I told Suzette I want to put this presentation out on Board Book and for the community after we talk tonight, because I wanted to make sure that it had some context around it. But I highlighted two of the equity non-negotiables that have really driven a lot of our work this summer, and as we've started to dive back into school this fall. And they are: together, we are responsible for the prevention of unmet potential, supporting student social emotional growth. And I know the board has received and the community has seen some of the things we've been doing around developing our skills and social emotional growth, especially during this very challenging time. And that our overall organizational improvement by eliminating inequities and acknowledging our own biases, which means that at each school site, we have to be having more conversation about where we are today and why are we where we are today, so that we can make some shifts in our practice in order to change that. And then the other one I'm highlighting is one that's really driving a bunch of the work a bunch of the blogging and the reflection work that our team did this summer, which is we will always persevere in serving students, even when that student lacks home support, guidance, or requisite knowledge, fails to exert the expected effort, or refuses to adhere to the code of conduct. And that does not mean to say that it is okay to refuse to adhere to the code of conduct. But what it means is that we're still pushing forward really hard to help that student become a citizen in our community after their time in public school is done, even when that is a piece of the understanding of their role as a student that they're missing out on. And the fact that we have an expulsion school, we talked about this at committee, is evidence of that. Because those students, even if they have committed an offense that was egregious enough that we didn't have reasonable assurance of safety to return them to a school, we still want them to have an education as they're a part of our community and a citizen in our community that we want to be sure has skills. So it's a good example of where we live that belief. So just to update everyone on where we are since those moments in June when we really started saying, if we wanted to be sure that those equity non-negotiables as our belief statements live and breathe, and you can see the action behind them, where would we be next? And so we hosted a summer workshop, 4 weeks with our leadership team. So again, that's principals, assistant principals, deans of students, and instructional coaches, as well as our district office team. For the 4-week workshop, we made sure that Shelley from recreation was included, Steve from food service was included, Steve from facilities was included, because this is the work that we share across every department that serves our students and serves our greater community in our schools. And so it was important to combine those. It was also the first time we had ever done a joint workshop within our student services staff as well. So that's all of our counselors, school psychs, and social workers who joined that leadership team for a shared workshop over the course of those 4 weeks. And each time we had some new learning, we reviewed some of the social justice standards, and then we made some action plans as to what we were going to do with that work and did some book studies. And each member of the team tonight is going to go a little bit deeper into detail on each one of those things in a couple of slides. We ended that time with 2 separate workshops, one in the morning for our leadership team with Dr. Emden, and one in the afternoon with our student services team with Dr. Emden, to talk about, like, what does it look like when you take action that creates change and eliminates some of the inequities that a system creates. And it was super powerful. And then after the morning workshop, the afternoon, the leadership team spent their time doing their school improvement plans, including their goals around how to mobilize this at each school site. And the board will see more about those in the next couple of weeks, as we just talked about those at committee, and we want to do more to share those more openly with our board and our community coming forward. And then we started off the school year with an equity non-negotiable reflection. And we'll talk about that again a little bit more as we dive further into the slides, but it was important to really dive into these equity non-negotiables. Before we adopted them, we did a series of workshops with our leadership team to write them. And then we had every single teacher in our school district review them at the school site, give us feedback. We adjusted and changed them before we adopted them. Then when we didn't really go back and look at them maybe as often as we should or we could, it was important to put that back at the forefront for our staff. So we opened the year this year with doing a review of those equity non-negotiables with some reflection on what do they mean to you and where do you see that work currently in your schools? And then what's your commitment to do one thing differently this next month as you dive into that? Our district-wide equity team continues to meet to then plan weekly activities at the school sites that are intended to be short activities to get new information around the social justice standards into schools with teachers, and then lots of time for reflection. How does this make you feel? Where are you sitting with it? What are some things you can do to take some action steps in your classroom? And so we were very ambitious at the end of August and had the start of activities planned for the whole single school year, and then realized that staff needed a little bit of space and time to take a few deep breaths and adjust to what they were doing in the virtual world. So we slowed it down slightly, and we're going back to it this week, and some of the groups will talk about that tonight. We're going back at it this month to really start pushing into what are those weekly activities that can be done at the school site. But in the meantime, many of the schools are also replicating the book study that we did this summer, and a couple of the schools will talk about that tonight, so that staff are having a very similar experience to the one we did over those 4 weeks in the summer, as it was pretty powerful. It not only connected us as a team, but it really got this work at the forefront. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to, I think, Alyssa, if I remember correctly. I can't see the notes with the screen sharing.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alyssa Johnson. I'm one of the deeper learning coaches at Horseman Elementary. And so I'll be talking about the identity standards today for social justice. So we've realized that you need to know yourself in order to keep moving our students forward. So we know that we can't get to the root cause of inequity or the core of equity without learning about ourselves. Our educators need to continue to grow in their understanding of their own identities of privilege, bias, and marginalization in order to recognize and stop the oppression and marginalization in our school systems. So we entrust teachers and staff to meet the academic needs and social, emotional, and physical needs of all of our students. So we need to develop the capacity of all educators and community members to work toward that systemic equity change. So we need educators to be more reflective practitioners who continually evaluate the effect of themselves and their beliefs and choices and actions and how that affects students, families, and others, especially because we're responsible for ensuring that all students, families, and humans in general are treated fairly, respectfully, and with an understanding of each person's culture and context. So understanding our own identity is the first step in this process. And so that's what we'll be doing for October and November.
And Alyssa, can you just give an example of what's one of the activities that they might be doing at the school sites with all staff
Yeah,
to help
definitely.
kind of understand the social justice standards for
Yes.
identity?
So this week, all staff members will be working on, it's called the Trusted 10. So it would be if I asked all of you guys to grab a piece of paper and to write down 10 people, not family members, that you trust. And so we would give you a few minutes and you would write down those people. At that point, we would come back together and then we would ask you to reflect on those people. Look at their age, look at their gender, look at their occupations, look at their education, look at their family systems, looking at all those things and seeing if you have a theme across and race, looking at a theme to see if there's anything is it generally all the same? Do you have a diverse relationships with multiple people, and truly looking at yourselves. And then you come together. So we'll be doing breakout rooms from there. And staff members are going to be opening up and having those conversations with each other to see where they're at. And so then from there, we'll be focusing on looking at, I'm trying to see how I can show you guys, but I can put it in the chat. It shows like for Milwaukee and Waukesha County, how based on your race, the exposure that you have to other races. And so what's really interesting with that is, I'll put it in there as soon as I can put it in, but it's really interesting to see that like if you are a white female or white male, majority of the people that you are exposed to in Milwaukee and Waukesha County are white males and white females. The percentage of other people that you are exposed to lessens. Now, depending on the school that you're going to and our beautiful West Dallas, West Milwaukee School District, we are a very diverse school and district. And so that changes. And so we really need people to develop their own understanding of themselves and their biases and everything like that to really meet the needs of all of our students.
Awesome, thank you. And then we'll jump into diversity.
And I think that's going to be my slide. I'm Steve Carr, and I'm the other Steve. I'm not from facilities, and I'm not from the food service. I'm with the leadership and learning team, and with diversity, obviously there's a progression here. And once we have an understanding of our own identity, understanding how that identity fits into the diversity of the rest of the whole is important. And as we explored in our group this summer, and now we're building out lessons that are hopefully going to be utilized in November and December to build off the students' understanding of their identity and what they know about themselves. And as I said, fit it into the context of the whole and appreciate, and I'll get to one of the readings we did a little bit later, but an understanding that in each of us, we have unintentional or intentional biases as part of our diverse culture and understanding. And as we grow in our understanding of where we fit in, also appreciating that others also have, value and understand that their context is different, not better, not worse, but different. And in many ways, very enriching for our community as a whole. So after we get after the conversations on a weekly basis about identity, we're going to then build out lessons that grow in our appreciation of the diversity of our students and our community as a whole.
Thanks, Steve. One thing I do want to point out is, as Marty shared at the start, is you read through these. So they're all, this is the whole set of diversity standards, these 5 that are up here now. You can see that the language in these is really purposeful and intentional to not have bias in it in the language in which the standard was written. So it says students will respond to diversity by building empathy, respect, understanding, and connection. That's something I'd have a hard time meeting anyone who didn't want to support students having empathy, respect, understanding, and connection for one another. that students will respectfully express curiosity about the history and lived experience of others and will exchange ideas and beliefs in an open-minded manner or an open-minded way. So each one of these standards is written in a way that is really intended to be part of development of humans that are part of a community of people that support one another. And that's been an important part of how we've talked about bringing the work into our schools. Now I'll pass it over to Chris.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Miller. I work on the leadership and learning team with Deidre and Steve. So I want to continue to emphasize the theme here that you can really think about these standards in terms of like an annual progression for students, right? Where they're exploring their own identity. Then they're kind of exploring the identity of others and learning about other people, so that when we get to these justice standards, it's really understanding like how everyone's identity relates to our history, like some histories of marginalization and sort of just like how students can identify injustices that are happening all around them. I also want to emphasize in here some of the verbs that you see, like recognize, analyze, identify. I have another slide where we'll see things like relate, recognize, and know, which really emphasize sort of like an empathy lens for kids. We're trying to teach them, now that they know these things about themselves and others, like how to really put themselves in other people's shoes and sort of understand the world from a lot of different perspectives. So I asked Deidre to add this additional slide, and this is not specific to the justice standards. You could break out all of the standards in this way, but just so you could see sort of the backside of what's going on here. So I included 4 example lesson plans, a K through 2 lesson plan, a 3-5, a 6-8, and a 9-12. So you can see that there's a lot behind the scenes in these standards. There's some really good lessons that have great essential questions for kids to explore equity through a lot of different lenses. It's not just race, but it's also socioeconomic status. That last one was about students with learning disabilities. This one's about the school cafeteria and the different sort of like dietary restrictions or just different diets that people, different cultures from around the world eat and how they may or may not be represented. This one's a lot about advertising on the internet and how advertisers might manipulate different people depending on what their identity is into believing certain things. So this, and the why local elections matter is just sort of teaching students about local politics and why, you know, oftentimes that those are the most impactful politics and how local politics affect their daily lives. But anyways, on the right side here is just a little snapshot that's broken out the 6th through 8th grade justice standards to show you grade level outcomes. And also there's an anti-bias statement that everyone's faces are in the way of, so I can't see it. But it felt like we needed just a brief little example that you can look at when you have time about how this might play out in the classroom. So with that, I'll pass it on to whoever's got action.
That's me. My name's Jim Young. I'm one of the assistant principals at Central High School. And so just as everyone said, there's a progression. Students will learn about identity, diversity, learn about what's just and unjust. And then the next and final component would be action. See, we've had our students learn about all of these things, or in this case, we were having our staff learn about all these things and what do we do? And so this summer we talked about how can we go into the school year, what can we make sure that we're living within the equity non-negotiables from the social justice standards. If you look through here, it even gets down into where it talks about students will speak up with courage and respect when they or someone else has been hurt or wronged by bias. And so for the last 2 months of the school year, that's an activity we'll be doing with staff where it's actually how do you have that difficult conversation? How do you hear something or see something going on with whether it's amongst staff or students and address it in a way that helps people understand why those conversations shouldn't take place and why they're harmful for our community. And so a lot of the last 2 months will be focused on these 5 standards here and how do we equip our staff and our students with moving forward to make an impact in the world.
Thanks, Jim. It was really important to us to also make sure that we didn't have people moving too far too fast before our community and our schools and our teachers were ready for some of those steps. And so when you think about working my way through, and I'll go backwards for a second here, working my way through standards that say things like students will develop positive social identities based on their membership in multiple groups in society. And so that would be where you would start, which is really just about yourself and your own family and your own identity. And something that Chris said is really important. This is not just from the lens of race. It is also from the lens of disability status. It is the lens of sexual orientation, the lens of all of the different parts that make up an individual's identity, socioeconomic status, and all of those pieces. We want to make sure that we're making space for our students to really understand who they are. And then when we roll into them understanding one another, then we go through what is justice in our community and in our world. And then we lead into action so that students really do have the background knowledge and staff have the background knowledge. The other thing that was really important was to dive really deep into this with our leaders. And so with our principals, assistant principals, coaches in each building, as well as our student services staff, because if we had to get to a space where we understood this work really well and could speak to it really well, now we're doing that with our teachers so that then we can do that with our students without getting too far ahead of being ready to do that work and do it right, because it is so very important to our communities. And it's a big part of the deeper learning work when you think about that academic mindset and that self-direction. When I feel that I belong to a community, when I feel like my voice will be heard and I have space to grow, the likelihood is I am going to work a lot harder and I'm going to bring parts of myself into that space with it. So these were the questions that we asked at the start of the year when we had each team at each school review those equity non-negotiables. What do these mean to you? Where do you see evidence of these in practice at your school? As our belief statements, how will you ensure you know them and embed them into your daily work? What resources or tools do you feel you need to mobilize our equity non-negotiables at your school? And what is your commitment to action in September? And these led to some incredibly powerful conversations at each school site. So I picked out a couple of snippets of samples of those, and Central and Mann are going to talk about theirs.
All right, so Jim Young again from Central. So we did this on the second day of PD, so we had teachers back for a day, and on the we wanted to launch this right away because we felt like it was so important. It was going to be such a guiding factor for us. We went over the mission, the vision, the equity non-negotiables. We talked about kind of how it fits into everything that we want to do and how we were going to tie it into our walkthrough, just all the different ways that it was going to be embedded in our school, and then had teachers do the reflection here. And so you can see some of the examples that Deidre pulled out. One that really stuck out to me was talking about what's your commitment to action in September. To be better than I was last semester and last year, to take what I'm learning, have learned, and will continue to learn and become a better teacher, person and virtually. Just kind of talking about it clearly for that individual, it really hit home what we were trying to do and why it was important. We had done a reflection around which one is the most important to you, and then they talked about it in small groups and then in larger groups. And it was important that from the very start of this year, we had our teachers, looking at things from the equity non-negotiable standpoint. And it's something that we talk about in all of our meetings. Which equity non-negotiable we're focusing on. It's something that's just always present for us now, and our teachers see it and understand it. And this reflection was a great way to jump right into it, and we were definitely encouraged by the responses that we got.
The big piece was to allow teachers to have that time to talk to each other and to create some leadership pieces for our teachers. A lot of our teachers, you'll see later with the book studies, some of the teachers are running the book studies. And it's the same here, is to give teachers an opportunity to talk to each other. That conversation is much different when the administrators are in the room. So we wanted to give teachers and trust teachers that they would reflect in that way. And so it was really important that they had that space to do that. So that's where you get some of that. And it was really important that we spread that message right away that this is an ongoing piece, right? That this is just not something we're going to do at the beginning of school. This is what we are doing for as long as we have to do it. So I think that's the difference, is to really, really bring that to the forefront right away, is that this is our process. This is what we're doing, and we're going to do this over a long period of time. So.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. We did a very similar reflection with our leadership team and our student services staff at the start of the summer, and then had them do it again at the end of the summer, and then shared back with them, what did you say when we started this process, and what did you say at the end, so that they could have some time to self-reflect and say, oh, that's interesting. My thinking has really evolved in this area or that area. And for our leaders, we captured those reflections in our blog site, which is a closed network so far. We're working on making that more of an open network here shortly for teachers to also add their reflections. But our leadership team started blogging in March. And so they had been doing some pretty regular reflections where they put their thoughts out into the world around all kinds of things. But we centered those thoughts around these questions for the 4 weeks that we did that workshop in the summer. And then here's some of the reflections from Mann.
Yeah, so Alyssa Johnson again. So this school year, my team and I have really renewed our focus on our equity non-negotiables and making sure it's the heart of all we do. And so we begin each meeting reminding our staff members of our why, so our equity non-negotiables, so we post that right away. So because of this, at the beginning of Teacher Week, we completed the first equity activity with our staff on day 1. So as you can see from these responses, it was a powerful and thoughtful experience. Our staff recognizes the importance of this work. You can see someone on there wrote, I feel our equity team needs more time throughout the year to provide PD for staff members, more time for collaboration and colleagues. Our educators see that we need to make equity a priority so we can do right by kids. So I'm really excited to keep doing this work at Horace Mann because it's growing our teachers' practice and it's really affecting our students in a very positive way.
And for each one of the activities that they'll do at the school site, they have built-in reflection questions so that we're constantly getting into that space of having open conversation around, again, how we create those communities where everyone has the sense of belonging. So these were some of the book studies we did this summer, and the team members are each going to talk about the one they either participated in or led, and kind of some of their reflection of reading that book with the team that they did.
So I'm going to just talk about How to Be an Anti-Racist, which was a really kind of an eye-opening book, not just to read, but also to share with a group of people who, frankly, from the different buildings and in different roles in our district, it allowed us to have some really difficult conversations around a central text that was really very powerful. And one of the things that we had to come to grips with in that context was these are going to be uncomfortable conversations. And we had to have open, honest exchange of ideas and perceptions of the reading. One of the things is that, the synopsis of the book is outstanding, and it really does hit at so many of the things that he writes about, and it's also a well-told story, so it's fun to read. It's pretty easy. So if you're looking for a text that really gets you started down this road, it's well written, and there's a surprise at the end. So I'm not going to tell you what it is, but it's a good surprise. I like the last line here, where he says, how to be an anti-racist, promises to become an essential book, blah, 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 who wants to go beyond an awareness of racism, and there's a long conversation about that, to the next step in contributing to the formation of a truly just and equitable society. The idea that I'm not racist is entirely different from being an anti-racist, and I see that in a lot of the other books that we read as well. So this was a series of meetings that we really got down to the heart of some of the things that were frankly unspoken and difficult for people to talk about, and this gave us an opportunity to do so. So it was a good text to be involved with.
And then I had White Fragility, It's a book that is obviously it's called White Fragility, so it's geared towards white people. It just talks a lot about the excuses or the phrases that I think come with the white privilege mindset, or just a white person's mindset, to where well, this racist thought or this racist reason. And so what the author does is not only identifies them but refutes them, and then talks about how they can be detrimental to our society or to other people. And she gives specific examples that she's seen in her career field, which is actually teaching about anti-racism. And I think that the thing that was really powerful about reading that was that it was something that, using phrases that we hear all the time, from family members, from coworkers, from maybe even from ourselves, and it points them out and disproves all of them, and spins them from a perspective of white supremacy, so that it allows us to understand why they're so harmful and why they need to change, in order to allow us to move forward in the work.
Why Are the Black Kids Sitting Together in a Cafeteria by Beverly Daniel Tatum talks about the effect of racism in public school. And that's what intrigued. This is the second edition. This came out originally in 1994. And it just explores the problem with identity and social justice and culture as it relates to school, and specifically to public schools, and how that some of the reactions from kids, she talks about kids in early childhood and how they develop notice differences between kids and how they react and the questions that they ask. What was interesting to me this summer was that, some of the principals were very, very candid about not, being uncomfortable about talking about this with the teachers. I thought that was fascinating, because that's where it starts, right? And then how are you going to talk to kids like that, right? This is the first time with what happened in this country this summer. We had never had kids, elementary school kids, protesting. That never happened. And so this is unprecedented ground here for what we're trying to deal with today. So in encompassing all of that, how are we going to have those conversations with children, especially elementary school children, or children that are, working on their identity pieces in the first place, and all of a sudden this comes into play. So how do you harness all that? How do you create space for kids to talk about that, and teachers, and how to feel safe when you're doing that? So I just thought that was a fascinating opportunity. And the people that I've been working with right now, some of the teachers that are in my book study, have just done amazing work, and really have to come to grips with some of the things that they have to deal with every day. So it's working well, but I think it's a fascinating book because it applies to our profession in public school generally.
And then I was placed in the book study of So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijoma Ilu. And she did an awesome job of breaking down all the different parts of race. So if you see on the media, they'll talk about many different aspects, and she breaks down the reasoning behind each part of it. So she talks about white privilege. She talks about police brutality. She talks about the Black Lives Matter movement. She talks about the systemic marginalization and oppression in our school systems and how we need to work with our students. It's beautifully written, and she's very blunt in the way that she says everything, and I think that's needed. And it provided us to be very raw with each other in our group, and that was a group that I really haven't met or talked to before, and we ended knowing so much about each other and became friends, and now talking outside of school. And so it was a very powerful experience talking about this book, and it's one that I want to replicate with my school when we're back. And so we realized in our book club that you need an awareness in your bias, but we also realized that this is a process and it's a never-ending journey. And so we're going to keep working through it.
Yeah, and some of the schools that have chosen to do very similar book studies to what we did this summer are Wilson, Hale, Central, Madison. Longfellow is doing a different book title, but of a similar nature to connect to the work they do around UDL at Longfellow. And there are 3 others that I purchased books for that I cannot remember off the top of my head right now. But that's always a voluntary process. So these were the books that staff chose to participate in the summer. It is voluntary for the teachers to choose to be a part of those book studies at the school level. And many times they'll come back and say, well, I'd really prefer to read this text, or could we read this one and add it to the library? And always, these are the ones the committee landed on. But we had quite a few choices when it came to those equitable opportunities for all students from many, many different lenses. These were the ones that our committee landed on, but again, there's lots of choices. And then just to give you an example, these are some of the questions that came from a couple of the different book studies. And one of the things we talked about a lot this summer is the notion of an individual saying to you, that's racist, or you're racist. And that's something within our schools and in our system that we do hear, and we hear more often than I wish that we did. And yet at the same time, we have to be able to weather that and hear that and approach the response to that from an empathetic lens. So what could we have done that would have made somebody else feel that way versus the inherent nature, which is to be defensive, to say, wait a minute, I'm not racist. Instead, to say, what have I done? What actions have I taken that perhaps have made you feel that way? And then let's talk about how accurate that is, or how we can get back to a common ground. And that conversation and practicing some of those things within those small groups this summer was, again, a powerful exercise in bridging the gap in a community so people can feel heard. It doesn't mean they're always right. Sometimes people will say to myself or to Marty all the time, well, I just feel like you didn't hear me. And I'll say, well, hearing you isn't always agreeing with you, but it doesn't mean that you weren't heard in that situation. We have to make more space for people to truly be heard in how they're feeling in the moment. Real or perceived, those feelings are to them very, very real, even if that's a perception of something that's being seen in a very different way from both parties. And so we worked a ton on that empathetic lens this summer. And how do we truly understand one another? We have tons of our schools right now doing empathy interviews as they're opening activities with students, where they're saying to them, tell me about a time you felt successful in school. Tell me when school was hard for you. What support will you need from me when school gets hard? And we have a classroom at one of our elementary schools where the students wrote their own empathy interview questions and interviewed each other as a way to get to know one another and some of their identity work. And that was a group of first graders who were not having a conflict question. They were truly trying to write questions that made sure that they understood one another in that classroom in order to build that sense of community in the classroom. The last thing we wanted to share tonight is our resource site. So as each one of these groups is being led to plan activities to do at the school site each week, we started by saying, oh, here's a list of resources. And the list was so long, it was impossible to even know when you would use any of those or what you would use. And so we had one of our school counselors, Lindsay Roper-Hetland, who's at Wilson, and one of our school psychologists, Brittany Durham, who serves both West Milwaukee and Pershing, who actually, with Alex Bruzan and a couple of other people, put together a resource site so that it could be in all one place for teachers, for administrators to go through and understand what some of those activities would be. And they're broken down into the 4 standards. And so if I go into the identity standard, it has the standards. And then if I dive deeper into this, it has lesson plans, and it has all of the pieces that I might want to use to continue getting at those standards for each lens. So we were thankful that they put it all together in one site and organized it the way they did. They are continually adding to it all the time. And so Kristen was kind enough to share with us some resources she had on understanding Indigenous people. And so we added a bunch of those to the website as well, so that staff had access to those. There's lists of books on here. There are articles. So a staff member, if they wanted to be talking about identity from those lenses, these would be a bunch of articles that we could do with staff. Some of them are appropriate to do with students, some aren't appropriate to do with students. They're more adult driven. And so for each one of the standards, there's a list of books, online resources, activities that you might want to do in order to embed those standards across content areas. And And then the last section is just how are we communicating that we are walking into this work with our greater community? And I'll let Marty jump in and talk a little bit more about that. But Beth and I worked together on writing up an article for the August newsletter. So there's a link to it in here if anybody wants to pull it out of the actual newsletter. But I did pull out the article as well, which is right on our website. And she kind of shared exactly what we've talked about tonight in the newsletter, because we want it to be for our greater community to understand the why behind the human nature of this work and why it's important. And then some of the action steps that we're taking to make sure that we are creating a pathway to equity through deeper learning. And then Marty has some next steps on top of that as well.
Yeah, so first of all, thank everybody from the team that's here for sharing your time and your experiences. I really appreciate it. So in terms of moving forward, I think I want to take a little bit of just a note from Jeff, what you shared, is that this cannot be one more thing that we kind of check off on the strategic plan or something. Okay, we did equity in September, so we did that. You know, the bigger effort is this has to become part of the organizational DNA. It has to become embedded so much that it just is who we are. You know, for the first time, we serve more Black and brown children than we do white children. And that's a really cool thing. And I talk about it like that all the time. But the reality is, in some places I talk about it, I get, wait, what, really? And sometimes there's a little tinge of either I don't believe you or I don't like that. And so that tells us we're going to get pushback in places, right? And that's both good and bad. It's bad because it's uncomfortable. It's good because it means we're trying to move in a direction that's right for all kids, right? So that's one big piece. And the way we kind of continue to work on both getting this really truly to be embedded in who we are and in responding to what may be discomfort in the community is really communicate. We have to be ready to talk about this. That's why I think spending the time in a workshop with the board is equipping the board with language and resources about how to talk about this. And for us to have kind of ongoing efforts around the equity plan and the equity work. And so a little bit of what I'm envisioning is something that we've been using and it's common communication tools these days, which are short videos, but they seem to be impactful for us in recent efforts, especially around, you know, the COVID pieces and some of the pieces we've done with urban misfits. So we're envisioning, you know, for different audiences, different people speaking, but you know, an audience, so different voices of parents about why this work matters, and that being kind of a message that goes out to the larger community or to other parents. I think moments where we have student voices involved, and even young voices involved, right? So little kids talk about it, they notice, they ask, and you know, and it's even more so now, like Jeff talked about, in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests and the challenges of the summer. And so having student voices be a part of that. So I think it's how we can shape the message and continue to have a message that this has to become and will become a deep part of who we are. So that's how we're envisioning kind of continuing kind of the messaging side of it. But it's really with the team continuing the internal commitment and work to make sure this actually comes to life for all kids. So with that, if there are questions for us, for Deidre, for the team, from the board, or thoughts about how we're approaching it, we'd love to get some either questions or feedback.
And I'm just going to throw one more thing in there before we move to questions. The district-wide equity team actually has a representative from every single school on it that meets with us regularly. We have another meeting tomorrow. But these, so I again thank the people who are able to join us tonight. Just many of them had other commitments tonight. So they all had the opportunity to come and join us tonight. And I was thankful for the folks who were able to join us tonight. But we do have representation from every single school that meets with that district-wide equity team and does all of this planning. So in each one of the standards, those are small groups, and they have broad representation from all kinds of different employee groups, as well as all of the schools represented.
Noah?
I don't have a question. I just wanted to thank everyone for their work on this. I feel it's a very, very important topic. Not only is it timely, obviously, right now, but I think it shows the district is prepared. When we were thinking about this before, a lot of the events that occurred in society. And so I'm very happy that we're, in my opinion, a little bit ahead of the curve. Maybe some of our districts have been thinking about this and that we're taking it head on and not burying our heads in the sand and thinking, well, we can just kind of go ahead with business as usual and things will eventually die down and be fine. And I think that's happened too long in our society. So I'm glad to see that we're taking steps to do what we can in the capacity that we have to start making some changes that we need to see in our society. So thank you for your work in that. And I'm definitely in full support of it.
Christine?
EJ, I just wanted to say that I really love the idea with the empathy interviews. I loved all of those questions. I think they're appropriate for all of our students to ask across the board. You know, what do you feel you're struggling with? When have I failed you as a teacher? What do you need help on? You know, and I think those are important questions for all of our kids. Jeff, while I have you here, you said in your comments, for as long as we have to do it. What did you mean by that?
Well, you know, I like a lot of things. You know, we start off with great anticipation, and it kind of dies down. You know, and I want to make sure that we have it ongoing, right? And we have so many areas to do that. Not just the book studies, but you know how teachers plan, right? How do they plan lessons, right? So why can't that be what we do, right? I'll tell you what happened to us. We had a survey probably 2 years ago, and a large majority of kids did not feel welcome to school, and it bothered me, right? And so thinking about that, and then having the pandemic, and then the whole thing over the summer, George Floyd, and all of that. And then Dr. Emden, we have to create space for kids to have conversations about those things, right? But what about our practice? You know, so what about our planning? How do co-teachers plan? Do we plan with equity in mind? You know, we have to start doing those kind of things too, and over a longer period of time, not just at the beginning of the school year. Here's our things, but we really have to make it part of what we do for a while. Like that's got to be ingrained in our practice. Another really cool thing that we did, Dr. Lexman and I, you know, we conversations about, you know, making teachers have more input with the SIP. So what we did was with our equity non-negotiables in mind, you know, we're going to kind of combine our educator effectiveness goals with the SIP. So everybody can have, or with the district college and career readiness goals. And so we're really trying to ingrain some of that and make it part of our practice all the time. We start every meeting with going over the non-negotiables. That's kind of always in what we do. You know, we have book study. Jim Young's been very effective with the equity piece as part of advisory is concerned. And so we've kind of, we wanted to make it part of what we do, right? Not just part of what we say. It's got to be part of what we do. And it's got to be part of what we do for a while. It's got to be, you know, it's got to be real. And teachers aren't comfortable. I'll tell you just one real quick thing. Why Black kids sit together in the cafeteria, there's probably, what, Jim, 12 groups? 12, how many book, just for that book? So those,
it's one of the bigger ones that we have.
So, right, so the teachers are leading those discussions, right? And so like when I said with trust, I trust them to do that, right? I trust them to be honest about how they feel about what's going on, and allowing, like we want to do with the kids, allow teachers to have space to say, hey, listen, you know, I came from a privileged Black background. I don't know what's going on. I'm uncomfortable. It's okay to say that. We got your back. We're gonna help you deal with that. But you have to have those conversations. You know, there's probably 12 groups. So all of those teachers leading all of those groups, that's that's what we see every week.
And Christine, just so you know, all of the staff had a training in how to do empathy interviews, which was the homework last year during a PD. So all the teachers were sent back to do empathy interviews with a certain number of students. So it has become a far more regular part of our practice. A couple of our principals are actually using those empathy interview type questions to do the first teacher evaluation meeting of the year and use them to combine the SLO and the student learning objective. We always speak in those acronyms, and the professional practice goal with that first observation. Like, where are you right now and how are you feeling? And let's start to combine some of the things we're doing or do them more efficiently, because otherwise things do start to become one more thing and they don't become that mobilized belief that we see in action in our schools every day. So tons of our teachers are doing those empathy interviews with students. And then when we get back the Panorama Wellness Survey, which we should have, I think, sometime this week or early next week, we also did that for all students grades 3 through 12, so that we had that opportunity to check in on where they are right now. And I put a sample, Marty sent it out to the board as well, a sample of what some of the questions that were asked in there, which were, again, of that similar vein of, are you connected to people? Do you need other support, so that we can follow up?
And we're only limited by starting at 3rd grade because that's where Panorama starts.
Yes, because the surveys they can't really find a reliable normed measurement for little kids to take the survey. They'll say they're happy if they like your dress or lunch was good, versus not necessarily being able yet to really reflect on some of those feelings. So we're collecting some feedback from them and still doing empathy interviews and things like that with the youngest of our learners, so that we make sure we're gauging some of those things. But it's really hard to get any kind of normed sampling out of the little kid group, so they don't do it.
Will everything that you shared in the workshop tonight be shared with the board?
Yep.
So all of the reading materials and all that?
Yep, the presentation is, Suzette's going to put it out on Board Book and make sure that it's out there for the public to see and for you guys to access. We just didn't want to put it out before the workshop because we wanted to make sure it had a context to it first.
Okay. As far as the Black history, are we using anything from the 1619 project? What's the Black history version of that?
As far as the Black History celebration is concerned, or what specifically?
Just the teachings of Black Lives Matter as far as the history of African American Black.
Well, teachers, this has been at the forefront of what we've been doing when school started, right? And like I said before, it's part of the planning of some of the lessons that are a part of the equity piece. So yeah, they've mentioned 1619. We are actually on the 3rd of November going to try to have, as far as with some of the deeper learning lessons, presentations to the staff. We want to make sure that the teachers have an opportunity to show what they're doing. And we have quite a few new staff as well. So I think once we share best practice, I think some of those pieces come to the forefront as well. We already started with a very successful Hispanic Heritage celebration, and now we're moving right into Black History Month and plan for that. And 1619 will certainly be a part of some of those activities. But I think that they have some of the 1619 project part of some of the lessons that one of them might be presented on the 3rd. I'm really not sure.
Okay. We did do a revamp, as we talked about at committee, and we actually started talking about that again all the way back in February, of some of the curriculum materials for our U.S. history course, just to be more comprehensive. That came out of some students making those requests to add some of those materials. So Steve Carr has actually been leading a group of teachers and students and a wider panel to really just review what's in the core content of our U.S. history course, to be far more comprehensive, not just from one race or one population or one anything, just to be far more broadly representative of all of us.
I actually came across a resource that I'd like to share with you that I think would be a little bit more balanced and more accurate.
Any other comments or questions for the group? All right. To much to everyone for being here tonight and participating in this conversation and all the work that you've been doing to this point and ongoing. Obviously, to emphasize and to say what everybody else was saying, like, at some point, this doesn't just become an initiative. This is who we are and what we do. So it's wonderful to see where we are to this point and what we're heading towards. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, we'll move on to our second item this evening, item 3.2, the 2020-2021 budget workshop. Ms. Windler.
All right, good evening. Thanks everybody for hanging in there for one more workshop. This feels incredibly unimportant after what we just talked about, but thanks for hanging in there with us. So we had to plug in one more budget workshop because we did have some updates from some of those budget factors that we get in early October that changed some of our budget for in a good way. So we'll talk through that now. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so just briefly touching on 1920 before I get to 2021. So in 1920, again, this is all unaudited. Our audit is in the works right now. And so until we have our final financial reports, we consider everything unaudited. So, but it's a very good representation of what we can expect when our audit is completely finished. So we are finally at the goal of, we've met our goal of the 20% fund balance of Fund 10 expenditures. And we addressed COVID early on, which put us in a really good spot. So that meant we had a purchasing freeze. We had a pause on hiring starting in mid-March when our school buildings closed. And that was an intentional action to put us in the best financial position with the unknown future due to COVID. So we didn't know what our own budgets were going to look like, what additional expenses we were going to have. We didn't know what the state budget was going to look like. So some of those things are coming into, we have a better picture of what that looks like for our future. We had additional savings when our buildings closed from utilities, from transportation, and from substitutes. And then that salaries piece is the piece that we've been working on as a team. So it's really a combination of our student services team and our human resources team, our business office, and leadership and learning to really narrow in on what our actual expenditures are in terms of salaries. And then we had additional revenue from high interest rates. So we had, if you'll recall, that $24 million debt that we paid off this spring. Until we paid it off, it was sitting in an investment account. And if you'll recall, prior to COVID, we had really high interest rates. So we earned more revenue on that 24 million than we had budgeted, which was great. So a combination of those factors enabled us to add a fund balance. So we're now at about 25 million, or about 24% of our Fund 10 expenditures. And that is after we've transferred 2.3 million to Fund 38 to pay off our debt, which we talked about last week. And we also have transferred 650,000 to Fund 46 for our turf field replacements in a few years when that comes down the road. So, and that's actually 2 years of the annual turf field transfer. So we've got 2 years in there now from 1920, because we were in a good spot. And just a note is that that's very similar and very comparable to districts of our size where we all ended up budget-wise. So now looking at 2021. So there are a few updates that we make in early to mid-October. And so when we plugged all these things in, it put us in a better position budget-wise than we had originally planned. So we had our pupil count. We had budgeted 8050, and our actual was 7868. So the weird thing that happens when you're in declining enrollment is that when you drop more than you expected, you actually end up with more money, more revenue, because of that declining enrollment exemption. So really what that means is, if you recall that calculation for what our revenue limit is, it's our membership count times that dollar amount per pupil, and then you add in those exemptions. So one of those exemptions that increases our revenue is the declining enrollment exemption. So when we dropped more than we had budgeted, we actually received more money from that declining enrollment exemption. We also updated our open enrollment ins and outs, and our uncounted open enrollment pupils. Personal property aid is another aid that DPI updates us in early October. And then we also have finally made the move from changing our revenue from a $50 decrease in that per pupil to a $179 increase. So If you'll recall, the 179 increase was what is in state statute currently, and the state DPI, Baird, everybody was telling us to use that $50 decrease in our budgets as we plan conservatively because we don't know what the state budget was going to look like. Well, the state's in much better shape than anybody really anticipated at this point. So we are now plugging in the 179 increase that's already in state statute and anticipate seeing for 2021. What we're hearing though is that the next biennial budget, which will start the next fiscal year in 21-22, is probably going to be worse for schools than taking the hit in 2021. And then an ongoing analysis is staffing. So like I've mentioned, we're really working hard to get our staffing closer to accurate so that we're not so conservative and we can really narrow in on those true expenses. Pupil count fluctuations. So I mentioned how when our pupil count decreased more than we had budgeted, we got more revenue, but that when that pupil count goes back up, which we are anticipating that at least we'll get some of those students back in our next pupil count, that we actually decrease revenue then. So we're plugging in a bunch of different scenarios of how our pupil count could fluctuate and what that means for our budget going forward. And then implications of COVID as a continuing thing, what we're spending, the staff that we're spending on is what really adds up, and trying to maintain some of those COVID funds, those CARES funds for 21-22 and not use them all this year. So those are ongoing analysis that we're doing on a regular basis. And just as we walk through our budget, we've been cautious and conservative and balanced. And I use the word balance like Dr. Lexman uses it, not necessarily in a budget sense, but in making sure that we are putting our kids first and making decisions that are best for our students as we move forward through this very unknown time. So once we plugged all these budget updates into our revenue limit worksheet, it ultimately netted us $2 million additional dollars to allocate in one way or another within our budget. So about 1.1 million of that came from additional revenue. And then as we narrowed in on our true expenses, we had about $900,000 there. So we have about $2 million tonight, which is why we're having another budget workshop, to allocate to areas that our board sees fit. So in looking at our long-term planning and priorities, so we investing in areas that reduce future costs on an ongoing basis will pay dividends down the road and allow for our sustainable compensation model. And that's not to say that a sustainable compensation model isn't a priority. That is the number one priority. Our board has reiterated that time and time again, that teacher compensation is our number one priority, but we need to be able to do things now that help us down the road. So another component of this that we've talked through before is that we have literally the richest retirement benefits package in the state of Wisconsin. We're in that 1%, that top percentile for what we pay for retirement benefits per student. So one kind of update that we've been talking about and haven't quite just started the process yet, but we've just been in conversation, is updating our retiree benefit package to have an HRA component. So rather than potentially just paying for health insurance, we would fund a retiree HRA so that the retirees would be able to use those funds for their health insurance. The thing with doing that is that it's something that we need to pre-fund to get going and then have an annual cost. So for some period of time, we would be running 2 systems, which would definitely be a cost, but at some point we end up saving money. So every year that we don't do this is another year that we're paying more for retiree compensation than we could be if we had gone down this road. So, and in 1920, I think, just as a side note, I think we spent about 2.3 million in our retiree benefits. And we talked about just recently, 600,000 of that was from the Humana plan, which is the prescription drug plan for retirees. Another priority that we've talked through that helps us reduce future costs down the road is investing in facilities. So as everybody knows, we are working through our facility master planning process right now. We had an administrative planning team meeting about a month ago. We have another one scheduled for the 28th. So that's still moving behind the scenes while we still work through everything COVID. But we know that if with facilities, if you put a Band-Aid on and another Band-Aid and another Band-Aid and another Band-Aid, eventually you end up spending more money than had you just done the full investment in the front. So that's another piece that will help us reduce future costs on an ongoing basis. And at the same time, we know that teacher compensation is our board's #1 priority. So the goal tonight is to just discuss about and identify what the board would recommend to allocate this $2 million in some fashion so that we can approve our budget next Monday. So we've talked through this as an admin team, and we also talked through this just before this meeting as a board financial stability and efficiency committee. So I'll talk through a little bit about what our two teams had to say in regards to this $2 million that we have to allocate for next Monday's final budget. And then if any of the committee members and the greater board want to open up discussion, that would be awesome. So as an admin team, we talked through taking this $2 million and allocating $1 million towards the teacher compensation, which is what we did last year. And last year we had an even split among teachers and among EAs. And we wouldn't need to necessarily, or we won't decide tonight how we would split that out and allocate that money if we did allocate towards teacher compensation, but just that we would have that would be a next conversation down the road. And then, so our admin team thought $1 million towards teacher compensation was a reasonable allocation of the $2 million, and then $1 million towards funding that retiree HRA benefit, which essentially would just mean that our budget would show $1 million surplus, and we would add that to fund balance so that when we're ready down the road, we can allocate our fund balance to the retiree HRA benefit. And if you'll recall from previous slide, we have about 25 million, right, about 24% fund balance. So what we could do is take whatever we're over, our goal is 20, whatever we're over that 20% to allocate to the retiree HRA. So we have a chunk right now. Unfortunately, I cannot say a dollar amount that might cost because we're in such preliminary, this is just only conversation at this point. So the next step would be to work with our National Insurance Services would be our vendor, and we would work through with them what this might even look like just to get some idea of what a dollar amount could be to fund that retiree HRA benefit. So our admin team identified splitting the $2 million between teacher compensation and retiree HRA benefit. Our board FSC committee just met and kind of went down a different path and thought we should allocate the full $2 million towards teacher compensation. Our conversations circled around, obviously HRA benefit is important. Obviously investing in facilities is important, but right now teacher compensation is most important. So board finance committee, if you have any additional comments from our conversations or opening up to anybody else to just, so our goal tonight is to identify how to allocate this $2 million so that next week we can approve our final budget for 2021.
Caitlin, is there a final slide other than after long-term planning?
So our what's next slide is that we'll dedicate funds from the final budget updates that we discussed tonight. Then we calculate the final tax levy and mill rate. And then next week we approve our budget.
I just want to make sure it wasn't like a summary of the conversation points because oh, I might need to refer back to those. So
thank you.
I can't see everybody else.
So I'm going to stop sharing.
No, go ahead. I know your hand's up.
So I just wanted to expound a little bit about our committee meeting and what we decided or what we landed on for what we thought. Again, as Caitlin mentioned, all these things are important things that we want to do. The HRA is something that if we keep kicking the can down the road, is just going to continue on. But the biggest issue that we had was that we don't know what that number is. And to put $1 million just to sit in the bank account, then later on figure out what that number is. And from some estimations, that amount wouldn't be enough to start it anyways. We'd have to find more money to do it. Considering everything that's going on, and this was not going to just be for teacher compensation, but this is going to be across all staff. So this would focus on everyone and how much harder everyone is working right now with the virtual learning and all the extra things that have to happen because of it. We felt as a committee that by utilizing this $2 million to not just put towards compensation, but really we wanted it to be putting towards a compensation model. So by the end of this year, we would have the actual compensation model determined and decided upon and ready to be put in place for next school year. And if we hope that if we had the full $2 million to do that might be able to push that forward more than maybe just the $1 million by itself would be able to do. So that was our thought process. And Brian and feel free, and Christine, feel free to fill out anything else that I missed.
Yeah, real quick. I think one of the main things that I touched on, I think we agreed on it as a group, is we just need to make sure that we're competitive to the other districts. And we've had this conversation for a while. It's something we need to put a focus on. And this just seems like the right opportunity to do that.
Kristen?
This is more of a clarification question just for me. When we're talking about teacher compensation, that's including like a new salary scale when it comes to level of education, years in the business, such like as that. Would that 2 million go toward that? Or considering almost like I guess like an additional check? We're thinking about that new scale we want to put in, correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, that's accurate. Yep. So last year we weren't, COVID hit, so kind of threw our plan for a loop there. But what we did with the 1 million that was allocated last year from the board was an even split. So the goal would be to have our plan in place that we'd be able to put this towards our new plan. That would be the goal. Yes.
So that, Caitlin, just to clarify Kristen's point too, so that when next year comes around and people are getting their, you've got a job next year and your new rate is going to be X. So it's going to be across the board. Everyone's going to know that because we put this resource towards a model, and then instead of just the CPI increase, they would also be potentially getting almost like a new offer letter, like your new salary is, based on that. And then new people would have their stuff, but they wouldn't know the difference because they're new to us. But it would be more sort of like in for-profit companies, you kind of get your annual benefits letter, right? And so at that you say, okay, now your salary for the coming year is X and you're getting a Y% increase or whatever. So that would kind of be across the board what it would look like.
Yep.
And one of the things that we discussed in committee was rather than using staff, using all employees, because we had, teachers got compensated the $12.90 last year and EAs got a little bit, but principals didn't see an increase at all. And this way it allows us a way to be equitable to all employees of the district.
Yeah, so we're looking at it as an all staff compensation model, how it would be classified. Okay. Yep.
Yes. Let me jump in. I appreciate that from the committee. I was kind of hoping that maybe if it's not going to be kind of committed to some of the other options, that it would include all employees, because we have challenges attracting, keeping leaders as well as EAs and substitute teachers, right? So we're a little low on the subscale, and I think that is particularly challenging right now. But I'd love to see us figure out how we get, EAs to at least a minimum of $15, which, is part of the national conversation of what's appropriate. And we're below that with EAs. And what's fascinating is, we described that we're, just trying to have the level of supervision support we'll need when we hit distance learning, just because of the rolling quarantines and all those kind of things. And so we have different positions out there, all of which will, at least when we start all of this, we'll be doing essentially the same thing, supervising classrooms where the teacher is virtual. And when we're out at $12 an hour, we get nobody. And in a position that we put out as youth advisor, which we'll then later use truly as our youth advisor model, when that goes out at $17 an hour, and there's a line of applicants. So it matters. So I appreciate that we can think about this more broadly. I want to get teachers caught up. And so this idea of, some investment that would move people in a salary schedule. So that's going to be a cost. And I think maybe we want to figure out, once we design it and figure out who's going to land where, it might be over a couple of years that we would need to move people, just because we want to smooth out the budget impact if it's going to be, more than the 2 million, even just to get teachers where they are. But those are strategies we'll get to. But I just, in general, appreciate the fact that we're thinking about this as all employees.
Gary?
Sounds like, can you hear me?
You're quiet.
So it sounds like the 2 million will pay for the model for this year. And then in future years, then that becomes an additional amount in the budget for the compensation, correct?
Yep. So we know that our teachers are behind. So in order to get them caught up, we're going to have to pay more money. So we are going to have probably to have some tough budget conversations. And we're doing this at a time where I just said 21 and beyond is going to be probably tough for education. So we're going to, have to think through that and likely have to make difficult decisions.
This also comes in on the heels of the facility study. So there's potential cost savings down the road with the way the facility study may or may not play out as well, and what decisions have to be made there too. So a lot of those things are going to kind of go hand in hand. Other questions or comments from the board? There's a lot of nodding when we were talking about the compensation model for staff, for all staff compensation model. There seems there's a lot of nodding. Are there any board members that would say, no, we should look at different options? This isn't a vote, but it's more, kind of just people feel pretty comfortable with that decision and allocation. So you've got some direction, Caitlin, going forward for next week.
Yep. So next week I'll show that 2 million. It'll be part of the salaries total that you'll see when we work through really high level next week. As we go through and approve our final budget for 2021. Kristen.
Just amazing job, Caitlin. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Oh, and your committee. Yay, committee.
Okay. Anything else for Caitlin? Oh?
I just said we just show up. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Great. Okay. If there isn't anything else or any other feedback, we would look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? All right. Thank you, everybody.